Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our new live webinar today. And I should say also to your TV program, FeedChannel.online. As often as possible, we have the opportunity to address some of your concerns, from the practical issue to its scientific explanation, with experts from all over the world, from science as well as from the industry or end users. And I would say, do not hesitate to propose also topics for our future webinars. Each webinar starts with the introduction on the topic, addressing the fundamental issue with the science, but also the practical issue with some field representatives. And a round table will allow you to ask openly questions during the webinar to our invitees. So I remind you, you have at any time the possibility to ask questions. Do not forget also to visit your FeedChannel.online platform, where you will be able to revisit recent events, such as the Poultry Science Association meeting last July in Orlando, and it will be shortly on the platform with a video on the oxidative stress sessions. You will have also the videos on the EC conference, the Gut Health seminar held in Bangkok last October, the Gut Health International Seminar, and also you will have the possibility to revisit the live webinar on meat quality organized last October, addressing issues on drip loss and meat color stability. And I would say, for those who were disappointed not to be able to ask a question during that webinar, we have worked hard to solve the technical issue. So I hope this time it will work fine. And if you want, and I can say also, if you want to be interviewed or post on the FeedChannel platform, do not hesitate to contact us. It is our fifth FeedChannel live webinar today, and we are pleased to welcome lots of registration people. And I just remind you again that you can post any question at any time on the platform. And if we have no time to answer to all questions, we will answer later on the FeedChannel mailbox. So formulating amino acid beyond building blocks. That's the topic of our live webinar today. Many congress and seminars have addressed issue around the amino acids beyond building blocks. It concerns the beyond the protein deposition, the muscle development or the reproduction. It could be the role of amino acids on immunity, the role of amino acids on gut functioning. It can be the role also of amino acids on appetite and acidity control, or even on the meat quality and carcass quality. So there are a lot of scientific progress, but how to take into account all those progress in the feed formulation? That is a good and important point. And there is also an important aspect today. We are all concerned by the sustainability of the animal protein production, and we want to reduce the nitrogen excretion. And for that, reducing the dietary protein content is a nice possibility to reduce the nitrogen excretion. However, as I said before, to take into account all those recent developments when formulating on dietary amino acid, it's I would say, sometimes it's a big issue, and we will try to discuss today about this issue. And I'm pleased to welcome today around the table two well-known scientists, and we start with Dr. Jaap van Milgen from INRA and AgroCampus West at Rennes in France, as director of the PEGAS Mixed Research Unit, which stands for PEGAS for Physiology, Environment, Genetics, and Animal Breedings. And I think it's important to consider that not only the animal, but we consider also the animal breeding systems. And he has also a lot of expertise on developing models on nutrient metabolism and amino acid metabolism. And Professor Mike Kidd from Arkansas University in USA as an expert on amino acid, and also as director of the Center of Excellence of Poultry Science, and who is well known also on the amino acid recommendations and amino acid knowledge. And I also welcome Lane Vigboldus from Cargill on Skype as representative of the field user and feed formulation sector, because they are at the first line, I would say, to take into account all we will discuss and all we have worked on to for formulation. So Lane, can you precise a little bit more your positions within Cargill?
My role in Cargill is that I'm nutrition lead in Cargill Premix and Nutrition in Europe. which means that I'm responsible for all formulation activities across species, as well responsible for all our laboratory activities. And formulation in cargo premix and nutrition doesn't mean just to push on the bottoms and send formulas to a plant, but also to design and yeah, I would say create the best formula which meet expectations of the customer. And the customer can at the end be the farmer, it can be a feed mill, but that's my role in this, to coordinate but also train the team members and taking care that we deliver what our customers expect, what needs to be delivered.
Welcome, Leine. Thank you. I suggest to first focus on defining what do we mean by amino acid requirements, or maybe I'm sure that Jaap will address that requirements issue, but at least what do we mean by requirements? And I think to start the discussion, I think it's important to ask again, Leine, what represents requirements for the feed formulator?
Yeah, requirements are always connected to the goal, what the customer wants to achieve. So for example, requirements will be different if a customer is going for daily gain or for feed conversion or in broiler production, breast meat percentage. So it's always connected to the goal, what the customer, what the final user wants to achieve. And it also is different between feed mills and completely integrated companies, for example, because they are judged on different aspects of it.
It's important to reconsider that, the objective of the requirements, but maybe asking Jaap about what do mean requirements of response of the animals to the scientist.
Well, to a scientist, and I think also in practical feed formulation. In practical feed formulation, we express feed values and nutrient requirements. They are based on a system. You formulate based on a net energy system or a metabolizable energy system or a standardized ileal digestible amino acid system. So that's the main point. We have to decide what system are you going to use, because what we want to do is we want to express feed value and animal requirement on the same level. You cannot mix a net energy requirement with a metabolizable energy value. Same thing for amino acids. So it is in fact a compromise between an attribute that you can, a property that you can attribute to a diet or to a feed ingredient, and a property that you can attribute to an animal. And we have to find a compromise doing so. So that's very important. You cannot mix systems. Systems are have to be unique and established both on the requirement side and on the value side. And just as an example to illustrate what we can think of in terms of requirement, on the graph you see a response of pigs to the valine to lysine supply in terms of daily gain. And what you see here, the individual dots mean individual animals. And I'll just let the audience think about what, in their view, is the requirement of that animal.
With the variability, it's quite a nice.
With the variability among animals. Now, and if you can, of course, apply statistics to this. And on the next two graphs, next to lines, you see two statistical models that you can apply to the curve. And you see that they differ quite extensively in the way they express a requirement. On the red line, it's a classical broken line curve analysis where the requirement would be 68%. And you can see that as soon as you are below that requirement, performance declines. The blue curve is a curvilinear response, and you can see that the requirement is much higher. So are we really interested in requirements, or are we interested in the response to the animal? Because you can see that below 73, 72, how much performance do you lose? So is it requirement or is it a response?
That's an interesting question, and also I'm sure Leine will have some comments on the benefits and economic benefits on that. Mike, maybe on that issue, we talk about the requirements on the objectives, I would say, but what about the model, and what about the issue, the products we want, for example?
Absolutely, and it's been well said by both Lynn and Jaap. The model is indication statistically to give us an idea where the response is occurring. What we have to rely on are the production functions of interest, what the producer needs to have a spec on, because you only have one number in feed formulation, and that has to be an economic optimum. So I really like the way the conversation is started here today, and that we're really not looking at response or a requirement, we're looking at what response is needed to give us the economic optimum in that. And it varies depending upon if we have the high meat yield versus focusing on feed conversion or calorie conversion. So depending upon the bird, depending upon the economics, we need to take that statistical model and backtrack into feed formulation for a good number.
It's a good point when you show the graph with the different objectives. And so I'm sure that Lane, when we talk about objectives, has a different feeling I would say a practical feeling on how to use the amino acids. So maybe Lane, can you comment a little bit further behind Mike on the objectives and requirements?
So these requirements are never, I would say, static, but they will be adjusted to the needs of the customers, like you mentioned, whole bird production or sales of whole birds versus breast meat. Even in countries where whole birds are produced and sold, people might have the goal to differentiate, to deliver a better carcass than competition is doing. And one aspect of that is breast meat. Then they are not, the breast meat percentage is not measured, but still important to achieve a better quality of whole birds by which they can differentiate compared to competition. And therefore it all starts with the discussion with the customer. What do they want to achieve? Where are they judged on? It can be that they are just judged on the 100 kilo price of the feed. Mm-hmm. Then you use other requirements than if they are judged on feed conversion, which is very typical for feed mills who sell feed. But integrators who also own the slaughtering house, the carcass yield or the cost per kilo of production is much more important. Or the output of the slaughtering plant, or so the daily gain might be more important, slaughtering one day earlier, more birds per year, and the better utilization of the slaughtering house.
So, yeah, thanks, Lane. So, talking about requirements, you have the model importance, you have the objectives, and the practical utilizations. I wanted to also address the question to someone else, Elisabeth Baeza from INRA in France, who is in charge of duck nutrition and meat quality, about what is the situation in the duck nutrition regarding amino acid requirements. And I've realized this interview last week at INRA in Tours, so let's listen to what Elisabeth said about amino acids requirement in ducks. So I'm pleased to welcome Elisabeth Baeza from INRA in Tours, who is in charge of waterfowl production and particularly on poultry meat quality issues. And regarding the topic about amino acid formulation beyond building blocks, I'm quite interested by how we consider, in fact, ducks in that perspective of amino acid formulation. And my first question would be, what are the main difference between broiler and duck regarding the amino acid?
Well, the formulation with amino acid for ducks, you must take into account that there are different species and different genotypes of ducks. So to produce meat, of course. So Peking, Muscovy, and the crossbred between these two species, the mule duck. And these different species have different growth rate and different body development. So you will not have the same requirements regarding the different rearing periods, so the growing, the starting, the growing, and the finishing periods. But of course, by now, the requirements for the essential amino acids, so lysine, methionine, tryptophan, and threonine, are well known for these ducks.
for both type of breeds,
Yes.
Pekin and Muscovy,
Yes.
and the crossbred.
Yes.
And we currently formulate in digestible amino acid bases, as we say in broiler or layer productions. What about the situation in ducks? And do we know the digestibility difference between ducks and poultry and broiler, I would say?
So until now, the formulation with amino acids, you must take into account the total amino acids for ducks. You can use the coefficients which have been determined for broiler chickens, but there are various studies who showed that these coefficients are lower for ducks by comparison with the broiler chickens. Well, there is now a recent study, who determined the optimum lysine, digestible lysine level for starting and growing diets, but only for the Peking ducks.
And what about, because there are much longer period of breeding, I would say, in ducks, what about the digestibility for finishing ducks, for instance? Do they catch up much more compared to broiler when they are older?
No. It is always lower. The values are always lower than that which have been determined for chicken.
Typically in animal protein production, we talk about sustainability, and one of the key points is reducing the dietary protein content, so trying to formulate with much lower protein diets. What is the situation regarding duck nutrition?
So the decreasing concentration of protein in diets was tested. Yes, so for Muscovy ducks during the finishing period, it was shown that it was possible to decrease the protein content from 15 to 12.4%. Of course, by keeping the concentration of essential amino acids according to the requirements of ducks. And recently, we also found a study who showed that during the growing period for Peking ducks, so that means between 14 to 35 days of age, it was also possible to decrease the protein content in the diet from 17% to 50%, 50.4, I think, but also by keeping the amino acid, the
essential one.
Yes, not all the amino acid with the same concentration for the different diets.
What do you think about the formulation, taking into account the additional benefits of amino acid beyond their requirement for growth or reproduction, for instance, like when we talk about sulfur amino acid and antioxidant capacities or threonine and immune capacity and so on? How do you think we should take into account these additional benefits, I would say, in amino acid formulation?
The only parameter which was taken into account in these studies on amino acids was the body composition, so mainly the fatness and the meat yield, but the effects of the different levels of amino acids in the diet did not investigate the effects on the meat quality.
Working on ducks, in fact, you work, I would say, in Europe, quite a lot of duck production, but also in China or Asia. And what are the main difference between, I would say, European type of production and the Asian type of production?
By now, I think that in Europe, the breeders have more developed ducks with a high body weight and high meat yield, because we cut a lot the carcasses, and consumers really want to have quite a high meat yield. But when you go to Asia, people use the carcasses, the whole carcasses, to prepare the famous roasted Peking ducks. Mm-hmm. And they want to have, they do not take so much into account the meat yield. They really want to have a skin with a lot of subcutaneous fat, in order to have a crispy
taste of
crispy skin when it is roasted.
So it's quite a big difference on the. And do they consider the amino acid nutrition the same?
Yes, of course. Particularly for the Peking ducks, which are now slaughtered at very early age, between 35, 42 days of age. So in ducks, the problem is that the breast meat is going to develop very late during the development of the whole body development. But for the Asian consumers, what is interesting is to have really this skin and this fat carcasses. So now with the lines they have selected for very high growth rate, they don't take into account so much the breast meat yield as you can have in Europe.
Okay. And last question maybe, and typically for French people, I would say, we talk about, the foie gras, fatty liver. What is the requirement when we talk about amino acids and this type of lipid deposition, I would say?
I will say that the period which is quite sensitive is during the restriction phase, just before the preparation to overfeeding phase. So during this restriction period, you have to be careful with the amino acid provided in the diet.
Okay, thank you very much, Elisabeth. So looking at another species, on another objective, on the requirements, like the ducks with the composition, carcass composition, fatty liver and so on, is quite interesting. But Mike, maybe after the model, after the objective, the carcass objective and so on, what about the effect on the genotype, effect of age and so on the amino acid requirement?
Sure. We've been looking at valine needs, and we focused on the cob female bird. Before we embarked in some of these studies, the first thing we had to do was look at the literature, and we standardized it somewhat. The table that's presented will show the different valine to lysine responses in male broilers only. Now, we took the liberty to take all of the literature, and some of which did not look at ideal protein concepts. They looked at maximal valine responses. So you have to be careful in how you interpret that, but we expressed everything back to the digestible level, and then we ratioed it to lysine, which could underestimate some of those responses for valine, but it gives you a apples-to-apples comparison of the literature. And there are a few studies that are below and above what we consider, say, in the low 70s to below that to in the upper 70s to the 80s. But for the most part, our experimentation is going to run from low 70s to upper 70s, which gives you a pretty good response curve, as we discussed earlier, to try and pinpoint the valine responses. In some of the past research that we did, the footnotes in the work by Thornton, she did her complete master's thesis on valine needs in a growing broiler, and the first response was down towards a 70, which was statistically the highest response we got, and we got no quadratic responses after that, but only linear. So we have the bottom to the top, and there's some variation there. So particularly with this amino acid, we still have a lot to learn, and we're currently investigating that at the University of Arkansas.
I think it's interesting to look at the amino acid requirement. And Jaap, what about the relationship with the composition of the tissue, the amino acids which are deposited, in fact?
These are basically the building blocks of protein. And when we think about animal protein, we typically think of it's one protein, but there are many proteins, different proteins in the animal. And on the slide, you see the composition of different proteins for the 6 amino acids that we have that are most limiting in most diets. And you can see that, for instance, muscle has a specific composition, but hair and feathers have a completely different composition, especially in terms of lysine, much lower in lysine and very high in cysteine. Endogenous secretions typically are rather low compared to muscle. So they have different compositions. What you also have to take into account that the way these proteins are being built and rebuilt and renewed differs. For instance, protein turnover is very high for mucins and intestinal proteins, where it is much lower in muscle, and of course virtually inexistent in hair. And you lose hair and feathers, but you don't renew them once they are made. So we have to take into account that there's not one animal protein. And even in muscle, if you look at muscle composition, muscle is composed of many proteins. Myosin and actin are the most important one, and you can see that also myosin and actin don't have very different compositions. And there's another protein, collagen, which can be quite important in animal production. It has very low in these 6 amino acids. So the way the animal is depositing amino acids, well, is it depositing muscle with myosin and actin, or is it depositing collagen? And if we have a limiting supply of an amino acid, what protein will he deposit? What will come first? Will the animal make priorities?
It goes back to the objective, in fact, when depending on the type of muscle you are targeting. Obviously, maybe the myosin-actin ratio is not the same, and maybe the needs of amino acid would be different.
Absolutely. And to go further a little bit on determining requirements, we can determine requirements based on an empirical approach where we look at some response criterion, average daily gain, profit to an amino acid. We can also have a look at amino acid requirements using a factorial approach, where we basically want to decompose all the elements of the requirement. And on the slide you see a decomposition of amino acid requirements based on the diet, and part of it is indigestible, part of it is being accounted for as specific endogenous losses. But if we base our system on the standardized digestible system, we have to account for the fact that the animal has to make basal endogenous amino acids. There's some loss for maintenance, and then there's an available amino acid supply. And even if that available amino acid supply would be 100 units, the animal will never ever deposit 100 units of that amino acid. There's always a maximum efficiency or a minimum catabolism.
And that will differ between amino acids, for instance?
That differs between amino acids because they are used for different functions. They are involved in different turnover, in the turnover of different proteins. And in the next slide, I have an example, a numerical example of the requirement of a given animal, weighing a pig, 50 kilogram pig. And you see some numerical values over there. And for those interested, they can reconstruct the graph that you see on the right-hand side. But you can see that basically, fortunately, the deposition is the largest part of the requirement. But there's still a large gray part. That's what we're looking for. Yeah. But you see there's a large gray part, which is called sometimes the inevitable catabolism of amino acids, which can range anywhere between, sometimes some people say for lysine, for instance, it can range between 20% and 40%. So what makes up that inevitable catabolism? Can we adjust that? Can we manipulate that? Because that is all the lysine or the methionine that is not deposited, but that contributes to the requirement of the animal. And in the next slide, I show you just a slide of because these things change over time. The animal changes its protein deposition over time, but we typically also change the diet supply over time, but not in the same way as we do as the animal does. And in this slide, you see the change in lysine requirement over time when it is fed a two-phase feeding program. And the green area that you see on the curve is basically the excess supply of that amino acid. We change the diet just twice, but should we change it 3 times, 4 times, or multiple times? So we have to take into account the different aspects of requirements, and especially with respect to the beyond the building blocks. The gray area is basically the beyond the building blocks, because these animals require these amino acids, but they are eventually lost. They're not deposited.
Yeah, so it's important to adjust these requirements according to time, and so that's complexify a little bit more the story, because we talk about model, we talk about objective, we talk about individual variation, but also in fact on adjusting on during the growth phase, and that is a big issue.